Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something completely unprecedented, and we're going to objectively investigate the real-world, measurable impact of dismantling the world's biggest foreign aid agency. We are talking about a $60 billion system that was essentially stripped down overnight. To understand exactly what happens when a massive global infrastructure is abruptly shifted like this, we're going to strictly follow the data on the ground. No politics, no assumptions, just a clear, honest look at the facts and the very real human outcomes.
Okay, let's jump right into this massive contradiction that's been absolutely dominating the headlines. On one side, you have Bill Gates accusing Elon Musk, who acted as the cost slasher-in-chief, of effectively killing the world's poorest children. Following this up, a highly publicized study in the medical journal The Lancet projected a truly staggering 14 million deaths by 2030 because of these closures. But on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, Musk staunchly insists the closure resulted in 0.0 lost lives. So how on earth can two sides look at the exact same event and come up with 0 on one hand and 14 million on the other?
Well, to find the objective truth between these highly politicized extremes, we've broken today's agenda into 5 parts. 1, a look at the ground. 2, questioning the millions. 3, the reality of aid budgets. 4, the end of easy fixes. And 5, choices that cost lives.
Let's start with Section 1, a look at the ground, finding the human reality behind the statistics.
When all USAID funding was abruptly cut back in January 2025, it sent an immediate shockwave across the globe. Now, temporary waivers for life-saving services were issued a week later, but the sheer confusion over who actually qualified meant a lot of those services never restarted at all. Zooming all the way into March 2025, we find tragic, measurable realities on the ground. Take the case of Prudence in Malawi. She was just 25 years old, and she died from complications during labor. Why? Well, while most maternity clinics actually managed to stay open, the independent firm that provided ambulances from her remote village simply didn't survive the funding cuts. This right here is fundamentally why aid cuts cost lives. It's not always the doctors that disappear, it's the logistics. In fact, health workers noted she was one of 10 mothers lost since January who would have made it to a clinic if transport had just been available. This objective reality proves that the claim of 0.0 deaths is plainly false. Cuts have a direct mechanism, and losing transport is a tragic prime example of it.
We see this ripple effect even more clearly in places facing compounding crises, like Somalia. Over there, spreading food shortages combined with the American funding cuts forced a full 25% of UNICEF clinics to completely close their doors. These clinics were heavily relied upon to treat severely malnourished children. And the direct result? The number of hospitalizations for these children doubled in 2025 to 768, and inevitably, lives were lost. Now, it's true that some of those patients might have perished even with treatment, but the data shows that some certainly would not have. The absence of immediate care directly translates to an increased mortality rate.
Which brings us to Section 2, questioning the millions. How exactly did researchers calculate 14 million deaths? If we know for a fact that lives are being lost on the ground, how did researchers leap from these localized tragedies to a staggering 14 million deaths? The crucial thing here is that we have to critically examine the data models pushing these apocalyptic numbers. The most famous one is the July 2025 Lancet study by researchers from the Federal University of Bahia. They looked at mortality drops from 2001 to 2021, controlled for GDP, and noticed that countries receiving more USAID money saw bigger mortality declines. Based on that, they projected 14 million excess deaths by 2030, including 4.5 million children. But digging into their methodology reveals 2 massive flaws. First, correlation isn't always direct causation. Aid bureaucrats traditionally favor giving money to countries that already have better healthcare systems in place, systems that naturally reduce deaths on their own. The researchers failed to account for this. And second, which is absolutely critical, their entire model was built on the completely false assumption that future American aid was going to plummet by 83%.
Let's look at another example of how these massive numbers get built. Researchers at Boston University tried to quantify extra child deaths from malnutrition, and their math looked incredibly straightforward on paper. Step 1. You take the $160 million cost of USAID's nutrition program and divide it by the $150 cost of an emergency food package. Step 2. This implies 1.1 million of these life-saving packages are suddenly lost. Step 3. If 10 to 20% of those children die without the package, boom, you arrive at 168,000 lost lives.
But here's the really fascinating part, the core flaw in that math. It sounds so solid until you look at how the money was actually used in the real world. Very little of that $160 million actually went to emergency packages for children near death. Most of it was distributed to women and children to prevent starvation before it even started.
And furthermore, the program itself wasn't even eliminated. It was simply relocated to another government department. So when researchers mistakenly assume every single dollar was an emergency ration that got entirely zeroed out, their mortality estimates skyrocket way past reality.
Moving right along to Section 3, the reality of aid budgets, what actually happened to the money.
This brings us to the macroeconomic reality of what occurred to USAID's massive $60 billion footprint once the initial shock subsided. Rather than a cataclysmic wipeout of the entire budget, American aid was overall cut by about a third, 33%. And the structure of these cuts is incredibly important for us to understand. The reductions were heavily concentrated in areas like education and promoting democracy abroad. Humanitarian and health funding, the exact dollars that directly prevent mortality, were actually shielded from the heaviest blows.
Just looking at the raw budget numbers here side by side, a much clearer picture emerges. Under the Biden administration in 2025, the global health budget was $12.4 billion. Following the restructuring under the Trump administration, the projected 2026 budget sits at $10.0 billion. Now, make no mistake, that is a $2.4 billion reduction, which is highly significant and absolutely has real-world consequences, but it completely dismantles the premise of that Lancet study. The entire foundation of their 14 million death projection was an assumed 83% reduction. As we can clearly see, the reality is very far from an 83% cut in global health.
That takes us to Section 4, the end of easy fixes, why future aid won't match past gains.
Even if we were to assume that funding had remained at 100% of its previous levels, economists point out a major historical misconception in these mortality models. Basically, there's an assumption that future aid dollars will have the exact same miraculous impact as past aid dollars. But the historical data perfectly illustrates the slowing momentum of global health gains. Look at the early 21st century. Childhood mortality in developing nations plummeted from 79 deaths per 1,000 births in the year 2000 all the way down to 42 by 2016. That is an absolute triumph, driven largely by what we call easy fixes, like rolling out widespread vaccines and distributing malaria nets. But pay attention to the trend line after that. By 2022, long before any of these USAID cuts even began, the figure had only dropped a little more, down to 37. The easy fixes are mostly already in place. So assuming that dumping the exact same amount of money into the system today is going to yield the exact same steep drop in mortality as it did 2 decades ago, it's just mathematically fanciful.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, choices that cost lives, the ripple effect of American withdrawal.
So let's zoom back out and confront the objective reality of the dismantling of USAID. Elon Musk's overarching theory was essentially a nudge. This idea that by America stepping back, other rich nations or organizations would be forced to step up and fill the void. Well, that completely failed to materialize. Instead of stepping up, other wealthy governments literally used America's withdrawal as a cue to scale back their own giving. Now, as we've explored, the apocalyptic estimates of 14 million dead were vastly overblown by flawed data models and incorrect budget assumptions. But this entire situation really boils down to one grim reality. Politics involves choices that cost lives. Fewer of them have been lost and feared, but it cannot be denied that lives have been lost all the same.
The human cost is very real, even if it's smaller than the headlines are screaming. When an ambulance isn't funded, when a vital clinic is forced to close its doors, those are the everyday mechanics of why aid cuts cost lives. And this leaves us with an incredibly sobering question about the future of global health. As other wealthy nations continue to follow America's lead in cutting foreign aid, who is actually going to step in to fund the gap? Or are we simply accepting a new normal for global mortality? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helped cut through the noise and brought some data-driven clarity to a very complex issue.